The sound of the auctioneer's hammer hitting would echo through the dusty storage facility like a gunshot, and Marcus Chen felt his heart skip a beat as he realized they had just spent their last $300 on a storage unit that might contain nothing but garbage. His twin brother Michael stood beside him, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, both of them knowing that this single decision would either save them from living on the streets or push them over the edge into complete financial ruin. The eviction notice crumpled in Marcus's back pocket, felt heavier than a stone as he watched the other bidders walk away, leaving him and Michael alone with Unit 247, a 10 by 12-foot metal box that had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, who had died 3 weeks ago with no living relatives to claim her belongings. Marcus pulled out the bolt cutters they had borrowed from their neighbor and approached the rusted padlock that sealed their fate. The storage facility manager, a heavy-set man named Pete, who had seen countless desperate people come and go over the years, handed them the key with a sympathetic look that made Marcus's stomach turn, because he knew that look meant Pete didn't expect them to find anything valuable inside. Michael wiped his palms on his jeans and tried to project confidence, but Marcus could see the fear in his brother's eyes because they both understood that failure today meant sleeping in their broken-down Honda Civic tonight, and every night after that, until they could figure out some miracle solution to their problems. The twins had been inseparable since birth, sharing everything from childhood toys to college dorm rooms to their failed technology startup that had burned through their savings and left them drowning in debt 6 months ago. Marcus had always been a careful planner, while Michael took risks, but their complementary skills had not been enough to save their company when their main investor pulled out and took their best clients with him. Now, at 28 years old, they were facing the kind of poverty they had only seen in movies, the kind that made grown men cry in public restrooms and forced families to split apart under pressure. The padlock clicked open with a metallic sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet storage facility, and Marcus felt his hands trembling as he grabbed one side of the roll-up door while Michael took the other. They had looked through the small window in the door during the auction preview and seen what appeared to be furniture covered in white sheets, some cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, and the general accumulation of a lifetime that most people leave behind when they die. The other bidders had not seemed particularly interested in Unit 247, probably because Eleanor Whitmore had been known around town as a reclusive old woman who lived alone in a small apartment and never seemed to have much money or many possessions worth fighting over. As the door rolled up with a grinding screech of metal on metal, sunlight flooded into the storage unit and revealed a space that looked exactly like what they had expected to find. Old furniture draped in dust covers filled most of the area, including what looked like a dining room table, several chairs, a large wardrobe, and a desk that might have been antique or might have just been old and worn out. Cardboard boxes were stacked 3 high along the back wall, each one labeled in neat handwriting with words like Christmas decorations and kitchen items and photo albums that suggested the ordinary accumulation of an ordinary life lived by an ordinary woman who had simply grown old and died alone. Michael stepped inside first and pulled away one of the dust covers, revealing a mahogany dining table that showed craftsmanship from an earlier era, but also had scratches and water stains that would make it difficult to sell for any significant amount of money. Marcus followed his brother into the unit and began examining the boxes, hoping to find something small but valuable like jewelry or collectibles that they could quickly convert to cash before their landlord changed the locks on their apartment door. The air inside the storage unit smelled like mothballs and old paper, with an underlying mustiness that suggested the space had been sealed up for months or even years before Eleanor Whitmore's death. They worked in silence for the first few minutes, both of them afraid to voice their growing suspicion that they had just wasted $300. They could not afford to waste on a collection of items that would barely bring $50 at a garage sale. Marcus opened box after box of costume jewelry, old books, and kitchen utensils, while Michael investigated the furniture pieces, looking for hidden drawers or secret compartments that might contain something of value. The morning sun grew hotter as it streamed through the open door of the storage unit, and Marcus could feel sweat starting to soak through his shirt as he realized that Their desperate gamble was looking more and more like a complete disaster that would accelerate their slide into homelessness.
The morning heat was becoming unbearable inside the storage unit when Marcus discovered that the heavy wardrobe against the far wall was not pushed flush against the back like he had initially thought, and when he squeezed behind it to check for any items that might have fallen back there, his fingers brushed against what felt like a small metal handle attached to the wall itself. Michael was across the unit inventorying a box of old photographs when Marcus called him over with barely contained excitement in his voice, and together they managed to shift the massive wardrobe just enough to reveal a rectangular panel in the wall that had been completely hidden from view. The panel was about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, painted the same industrial gray as the rest of the storage unit walls, but clearly designed to be removable. And when Marcus pressed on one corner, it clicked inward like a latch mechanism that someone had installed with great care and attention to concealment. Behind the hidden panel lay a narrow compartment that extended back into the wall space between storage units. And inside this secret hiding place were items that made both twins stop breathing for several seconds as they tried to process what they were seeing. There were manila envelopes thick with documents, several small wooden boxes that looked handcrafted and expensive, rolls of papers tied with ribbon, and photograph albums bound in leather that appeared much older and more valuable than anything else they had found in Eleanor Whitmore's belongings. Marcus reached in first and pulled out one of the manila envelopes, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it to reveal legal documents with letterheads from banks and law firms, some of them dating back to the 1960s and written in formal language that neither twin fully understood, but that clearly involved significant amounts of money and property transfers. The photographs in the leather albums showed Eleanor Whitmore as a much younger woman, but she was not alone in these pictures like Marcus and Michael had expected based on her reputation as a recluse who had lived her final years in isolation. Instead, she appeared in dozens of photographs alongside men in expensive suits and women in elegant dresses, standing in front of art galleries and museums, attending formal dinner parties, and traveling to locations around the world that suggested a lifestyle of wealth and sophistication that seemed completely inconsistent with the simple apartment and modest possessions that the twins had heard described by people who knew her in her later years. In several of the photographs, Eleanor was standing next to paintings and sculptures that even Marcus and Michael, who knew very little about art, could recognize as the kind of masterpieces that belonged in major museums or private collections worth millions of dollars. One wooden box contained what appeared to be a safety deposit box key along with a small card that had a bank name and a series of numbers written in the same neat handwriting they had seen on the storage unit boxes, while another box held jewelry that was clearly not costume pieces, but genuine stones set in gold and platinum that caught the light streaming through the storage unit door and threw sparkles across the concrete floor. Michael picked up a necklace that featured a single large emerald surrounded by diamonds and held it up to the light, both twins recognizing immediately that they were looking at something worth more money than they had ever seen in their lives, but also feeling a growing sense of unease about how Eleanor Whitmore had come to possess such valuable items while living such an apparently modest existence in her final years. The documents in the manila envelopes became more interesting and more confusing the deeper Marcus dug into them, with bank statements showing large deposits and withdrawals throughout the 1960s and 1970s, legal papers involving property transfers in multiple states, and correspondence with law firms that seemed to be managing some kind of trust or estate on Eleanor's behalf. There were also letters written in what appeared to be code or cipher, with combinations of numbers and letters that meant nothing to either twin, but that had obviously been important enough for Eleanor to preserve carefully for decades in her secret hiding place. One envelope contained newspaper clippings from the early 1960s, and when Marcus spread them out on the dusty floor of the storage unit, he and Michael found themselves reading about a major art theft that had occurred at a private gallery in New York City in 1962. Involving the disappearance of several paintings worth what would be tens of millions of dollars in today's money. The newspaper articles described the theft as one of the most sophisticated art heists in American history, carried out by professionals who had somehow bypassed multiple security systems and made off with 6 paintings, including works by famous artists whose names even Marcus and Michael recognized from their college art appreciation classes. The FBI had investigated the case for years without recovering the stolen artwork or identifying thieves, and the articles suggested that the paintings had likely been sold to private collectors who kept them hidden away from public view, making recovery nearly impossible even decades after the original crime. As Marcus read the details of the heist aloud to his brother, both twins began to understand that Eleanor Whitmore's secret compartment might contain information related to one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the art world, and that their $300 gamble on an abandoned storage unit was starting to look like something much more dangerous and potentially lucrative than either of them had imagined when they raised their hands at the auction that morning. The drive to First National Bank felt like the longest 20 minutes of Marcus and Michael's lives, as they sat in their battered Honda Civic with the safety deposit box key burning like a hot coal in Marcus's pocket. Both twins trying to process the implications of what they had discovered, while also fighting the paranoid feeling that everyone they passed on the street somehow knew what they were carrying and might try to stop them before they could find out what Eleanor Whitmore had hidden away in her bank vault. Michael kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced that they were being followed even though he could not identify any specific vehicle that seemed suspicious, while Marcus clutched the bank card and tried to figure out how they were going to explain to a bank employee that they had the right to access a safety deposit box that belonged to a dead woman they had never met and whose belongings they had purchased at a storage auction just hours earlier. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Collins, who had worked at First National for 15 years, examined their documentation with a kind of professional skepticism that made both twins sweat despite the air conditioning in her office. But after making several phone calls to verify their story and checking Eleanor Whitmore's account records, she reluctantly agreed to escort them to the safety deposit box vault in the basement of the bank building. The vault itself looked exactly like something from a movie, with rows of small metal doors lining the walls and requiring 2 keys to open, one held by the bank and one that Marcus produced from his trembling hand. And when Patricia Collins turned both keys simultaneously, the small door swung open to reveal a metal box that was heavier than either twin had expected when they lifted it out and carried it to the private viewing room. Inside the safety deposit box, they found items that made the discoveries in the storage unit seem almost insignificant by comparison, starting with a hand-drawn map that showed detailed layouts of several buildings in different cities, along with what appeared to be specific instructions for accessing hidden areas within those structures. The map was accompanied by a series of letters written in the same code they had seen in Eleanor's storage unit, but these letters were much longer and more detailed, suggesting complex plans or instructions that someone had taken great care to preserve and protect from discovery. There were also more photographs, but these showed Eleanor with different people in different settings, and several of the images appeared to have been taken secretly or without the knowledge of the subjects, giving them the quality of surveillance photographs rather than social snapshots. Marcus was studying the coded letters when Michael made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about Eleanor Whitmore and her connection to the art heist they had read about in the newspaper clippings. Because at the bottom of the safety deposit box underneath all the other materials was an envelope marked with official FBI letterhead and containing credentials that identified Eleanor Whitmore as a federal agent who had been working undercover for more than 30 years, investigating art theft and organized crime. The credentials were accompanied by contact information for FBI supervisors and detailed reports about criminal organizations that specialized in stolen artwork, including specific individuals who were suspected of involvement in the 1962 gallery heist that had made headlines decades earlier and apparently remained an active investigation even after all these years. The realization that Eleanor had been a federal agent rather than simply an elderly recluse with mysterious possessions hit both twins like a physical blow. because it meant that everything they had found was likely evidence in ongoing criminal investigations, and that their innocent purchase of an abandoned storage unit had somehow made them participants in federal law enforcement operations that they did not understand and were not prepared to handle. Michael immediately wanted to contact the FBI and turn over everything they had discovered, arguing that they were in over their heads and needed professional help before they got into serious legal trouble. But Marcus insisted that they needed to understand what they had stumbled into before involving law enforcement agents who might decide that the twins themselves were suspects rather than innocent bystanders who had accidentally uncovered important evidence. Their debate was interrupted by the sound of Patricia Collins knocking on the viewing room door to inform them that their time was up, and they needed to either return the safety deposit box contents to the vault or remove them from the bank premises. And both twins realized simultaneously that they were facing a decision that would determine the rest of their lives, because whatever they chose to do with Eleanor Whitmore's secrets would have consequences they could not predict or control. Marcus quickly gathered all the materials and stuffed them into a large envelope, while Michael signed the necessary paperwork to close Eleanor's safety deposit box account. And within minutes, they were walking back to their car with evidence that could potentially solve one of the most famous art thefts in American history, but could also make them targets of the same criminal organizations that Eleanor had spent decades investigating. The drive home felt even more tense than the trip to the bank, because now they knew for certain that they were carrying materials that dangerous people would kill to possess. And every car that followed them for more than a few blocks made both twins wonder if their $300 investment in an abandoned storage unit was about to cost them much more than they could afford to pay. The twins had barely made it through the front door of their cramped apartment when they heard the heavy footsteps on the stairs outside, followed by a deliberate knock that was too loud and too confident to be from their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, or the pizza delivery driver they had been expecting later that evening. Marcus quickly shoved Eleanor's envelope of documents under the couch cushions, while Michael peered through the peephole to see two men in expensive suits standing in the hallway, their faces showing the kind of patient menace that suggested they were accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation rather than polite conversation. The taller man had silver hair and scars on his knuckles that were visible even from a distance, while his companion was younger, but carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent time in either the military or prison, and both men were scanning the hallway with the professional awareness of people who made their living through violence, and were always prepared for trouble. Michael stepped away from the door and whispered urgently to his brother that they needed to call the police immediately. But before Marcus could respond, the knocking came again, this time accompanied by a voice that was calm and polite, but carried an underlying threat that made both twins understand they were dealing with people who would not be easily discouraged or fooled by pretending not to be home. The man identified himself as Vincent Torino and claimed to be a business associate of Eleanor Whitmore, who needed to discuss some property that had belonged to her, speaking in the kind of measured tone that suggested he already knew exactly what the twins had found and was simply going through the motions of politeness before moving to more direct methods of persuasion. Marcus recognized the name Vincent Torino from some of the FBI documents they had discovered, where he had been identified as a suspected member of an organized crime family with connections to art theft and money laundering operations that stretch back decades. The twins exchanged glances that communicated their shared understanding that opening the door would be a mistake, but that refusing to answer might provoke these men into more aggressive action. And they could hear movement in the hallway that suggested Vincent and his companion were not planning to leave quietly if their polite approach was unsuccessful. Michael grabbed his cell phone and started to dial 911, but Marcus stopped him with a gesture, because they both realized that involving the police at this point would require explaining how they had come to possess federal evidence related to ongoing criminal investigations, and there was no guarantee that law enforcement would view them as innocent victims rather than suspects who had somehow obtained materials they should not have. The sound of metal against metal came from the direction of their front door, suggesting that Vincent's companion was working on the lock with tools that would make their polite knocking irrelevant within the next few minutes. Marcus made a decision that surprised both himself and his brother by grabbing Eleanor's envelope from under the couch cushions and heading toward the back window of their apartment, which opened onto a fire escape that they had never used, but that suddenly represented their only chance of avoiding a confrontation with people who were clearly prepared to use violence to get what they wanted. Michael followed his brother without question, understanding that their situation had moved far beyond anything they could handle through normal channels, like calling the police or trying to reason with their unwelcome visitors. And within seconds, both twins were climbing through the window onto the rusty metal platform of the fire escape just as they heard the unmistakable sound of their front door being forced open. The fire escape led down into an alley behind their apartment building, and Marcus and Michael moved as quickly as they could while trying to remain quiet, both of them aware that Vincent and his companion would realize what had happened as soon as they searched the empty apartment and would likely be looking for other ways out of the building. The alley connected to a maze of side streets that the twins knew well from years of living in the neighborhood. But they also understood that their familiarity with the area would be meaningless if they were being pursued by professionals who had resources and connections that two broke college graduates could never match. Michael suggested they go to the police station immediately and turn over everything they had found, arguing that federal agents would be better equipped to protect them than they were to protect themselves. But Marcus insisted that they needed time to think and plan before involving law enforcement in a situation they still did not fully understand. They spent the next hour moving through back streets and alleys, stopping frequently to check whether they were being followed and trying to figure out how Vincent Torino had learned about their purchase of Eleanor's storage unit so quickly after they had made their discoveries at the bank. Marcus realized that their activities throughout the day had probably been much less secret than they had assumed, because storage unit auctions were public events attended by regular buyers who knew each other and talked about interesting purchases, and bank employees like Patricia Collins might have made phone calls or filed reports that had somehow reached the wrong people through channels that the twins could not have anticipated or avoided. The weight of Eleanor's envelope in Marcus's jacket pocket felt heavier with each block they walked, and both twins were beginning to understand that their $300 gamble had involved them in something much more dangerous and complex than a simple treasure hunt that would solve their financial problems. As evening approached and the streets became busier with people heading home from work, Marcus and Michael found themselves in a downtown area near the public library, and they decided to go inside where they could blend in with other patrons while trying to make sense of Eleanor's coded letters and maps using the research resources available on the library computers. The library felt safe and anonymous, but both twins knew that their sense of security was probably an illusion because people like Vincent Torino had resources and connections that would eventually allow them to track down anyone they wanted to find. And the only real question was how much time the twins had before their pursuers caught up with them. The public library's computer terminal felt like their last refuge, as Marcus hunched over the keyboard trying to decode Eleanor's cryptic letters, while Michael kept watch near the windows. Both twins acutely aware that every person who entered the building could potentially be working for Vincent Torino or the criminal organization that seemed determined to recover whatever secrets Eleanor Whitmore had been protecting for decades. The coded messages were more complex than anything either twin had encountered before, using a combination of numbers, letters, and symbols that suggested military or intelligence training. But after 2 hours of patient work, Marcus began to recognize patterns that allowed him to decipher fragments of Eleanor's hidden communications with her FBI handlers and other federal agents involved in the long-running investigation into stolen artwork and organized crime. What Marcus discovered in those decoded messages changed everything they thought they understood about Eleanor's death and their accidental involvement in her decades-long undercover operation, because the letters revealed that Eleanor had not died of natural causes, as everyone in town believed, but had been murdered by Vincent Torino's organization after they discovered her true identity as a federal agent who had been gathering evidence against them for more than 30 years. The coded correspondence showed that Eleanor had been preparing to testify in a major federal prosecution that would have resulted in arrests and convictions that could have destroyed one of the most successful art theft operations in American criminal history. And her death had been carefully arranged to look like the natural passing of an elderly woman with health problems that no one would question or investigate too closely. Even more disturbing was Eleanor's final coded message to her FBI contacts, written just days before her death and hidden in the safety deposit box, along with detailed evidence about the location of stolen artwork worth more than $50 million that had been hidden away since the famous 1962 gallery heist and several other major thefts that had never been solved. Eleanor had discovered that the stolen paintings were being stored in a warehouse facility owned by a legitimate business that served as a front for money laundering operations, and she had been planning to lead federal agents to recover the artwork when Vincent Torino's people had eliminated her to prevent the raid that would have exposed their entire criminal enterprise. The map that Marcus and Michael had found was actually a detailed floor plan of the warehouse facility, complete with security information and specific instructions for accessing the hidden rooms where the stolen masterpieces had been kept for decades. Michael was studying the decoded messages over his brother's shoulder when he noticed a familiar figure entering the library through the main entrance, and his blood turned cold as he recognized the younger man who had accompanied Vincent Torino to their apartment earlier that day, now dressed in casual clothes and moving through the library with the careful attention of someone who was hunting rather than browsing for books. Michael grabbed his brother's arm and whispered urgently that they needed to leave immediately through the back exit, but Marcus was reluctant to abandon the computer terminal, where he had been making progress decoding Eleanor's messages, and their moment of hesitation gave Vincent's associate enough time to spot them and begin moving in their direction, with a kind of purposeful stride that suggested the polite phase of their relationship was definitely over. The twins gathered Eleanor's materials as quickly as possible and headed toward the rear of the library, moving through the stacks and past study tables where other patrons sat reading and working, completely unaware that they were witnessing what might be a life or death chase between people involved in one of the most significant criminal investigations in federal law enforcement history. Marcus stuffed the decoded messages into his jacket pocket along with Eleanor's original documents, understanding that they now possessed information that could not only solve multiple art theft cases, but also provide evidence for murder charges against Vincent Torino and his criminal organization, making them incredibly valuable witnesses who would need federal protection if they hoped to survive long enough to testify about what they had discovered. The library's back exit led into a parking area that was mostly empty at this time of evening, and Marcus and Michael had made it halfway to their car when they heard running footsteps behind them and realized that Vincent's associate had followed them outside and was no longer making any attempt to be subtle about his intentions. Michael fumbled with the car keys while Marcus turned to face their pursuer, who was now close enough that they could see he was carrying something in his right hand that was probably a weapon, and both twins understood that their situation had escalated beyond anything they could handle through running or hiding or hoping that law enforcement would somehow intervene before it was too late. The confrontation in the parking lot lasted less than 30 seconds, but it changed the trajectory of both twins' lives forever because Vincent's associate made the mistake of underestimating two desperate young men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by fighting back against people who wanted to silence them permanently. Michael managed to get the car started while Marcus used Eleanor's heavy safety deposit box key as an improvised weapon, and within moments they were driving away from the library at dangerous speeds while their attacker lay unconscious on the asphalt behind them, giving them a temporary head start but also escalating their conflict with Vincent Torino's organization to a level where compromise or negotiation would no longer be possible. As they drove through the darkening streets toward an uncertain destination, both twins realized that their accidental discovery of Eleanor Whitmore's secrets had transformed them from broke college graduates facing eviction into key witnesses in a federal criminal investigation who were now being hunted by professional killers. and that their only chance of survival lay in finding a way to contact the FBI agents who had been Eleanor's handlers and convincing them to provide protection in exchange for testimony that could finally bring justice for Eleanor's murder and recover artwork that had been missing for more than 60 years.